1, 2, 3, 4. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk. Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk, Spock talk.
Welcome to Talk Spock, the podcast that explores what's the deal with Dr. Benjamin Spock. How did baby and child care become the preeminent parenting guide of the 20th century? Who gets to tell parents how to parent?
First of all, who are we? And why are we talking Dr. Spock?
I'm Deborah.
And I'm Katie.
And we co-host another podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review television and movie made for kids. It's really fun. You should subscribe and listen to it.
We met in library school a long time ago at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and for a while we worked as a reference librarian and an archivist, until we each had kids and the demands of parenting made full-time work impossible. Now, besides hosting our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, Deborah is a freelance writer, and I, Katie, am an early childhood music educator. Deborah, why Spock?
Good question. Why talk about Dr. Spock at all? He's not even of this century. He was born in 1903 and died in 1998. He never listened to a podcast. Spock was the author of a book titled The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, published in 1946, which was revised into 10 different editions over the course of the 1900s and 2000s as Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care. The latest, the 10th edition, was published in 2018. Let me center myself in this discussion for a moment. My first child was born in 2009, and I got a copy of the 8th edition as a baby gift, which was published in 2004. And since I had my first kid, there have been 2 more editions of Dr. Spock's Baby and Child Care. Katie, did you read any Spock when your kids were babies?
The parenting books that loomed large in my early parenting life were Dr. Sears books rather than Dr. Spock. William Sears' The Baby Book was first published in 1993 and popularized attachment parenting, which was certainly the de rigueur parenting style when my kids were born, which, by the way, was 2015. I also, of course, as a Francophile, read and loved Bringing Up Bebe, the 2014 parenting book by Pamela Druckerman. So, needless to say, Dr. Spock was not a presence on my bookshelf, though I was certainly aware of his existence.
I read both of those books, and I can't say they improved my parenting, but I did enjoy Druckerman's account of raising a child in France.
Yeah, I definitely every once in a while think about all the things that I do not do that she recommended.
Now, we want to explore the life and legacy of this old guy from the 1900s because what is the deal? Why are his books still being revised and published? Was his parenting advice really that great? About a year ago, having been out of the baby game for many years, I noticed that the baby care or parenting trends that were a big deal when I was a new mom, not that long ago, are not even a thing anymore. Attachment parenting seems to have been rebranded as koala parenting. There's a trend on TikTok about gentle parenting, or maybe that's over. I don't know. I'm not on TikTok. Are there any parenting trends that are passing you by?
Well, first off, I was totally unaware of this koala parenting thing. It definitely feels like the pendulum is maybe swinging away from the super extreme permutation of attachment parenting. Essentially that all needs of the parent are ignored in favor of those of the baby, to one that recognizes parents' needs to maintain their own lives again. It felt like there were some really goofy trends taking off there for a while that we've maybe backed off on. I mean, self-care is such a buzzword that has permeated our culture. It's natural to assume that it's making its way into parenting culture too. Parenting trends just go so fast, and we want to understand what it is about Dr. Spock's work that endures. Why is he around, or why is his brand around 25 years after he died?
In this first episode, we'll take a look at parenting guides written before Spock's seminal work. Subsequent episodes will examine Spock's childhood, education, and early career in pediatrics and psychoanalysis. his political activism, his attitudes toward women, the post-industrial professionalization of the domestic sphere. We are going to get into all of it. Who was this guy? Where and when did he accomplish his work? How did he get so popular? And how vast was his influence?
Let's jump into our first question. Was Spock popular because the advice written before baby and childcare was pretty bad? Let's set the scene of what parenting advice was like in the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s.
First, there were experts who are classified as authoritarians or hygienists. In 1894, a pediatrician named L. Emmett Holt published a book titled The Care and Feeding of Children. Pediatrics was kind of a new field, and Holt was the founder of the American Pediatric Society. Here's some highlights. Throughout his book, Holt referred to the baby as it. He advised against rocking. He advocated for crying. In fact, he wrote, "Crying is the baby's exercise."
Can we just sidebar about whether or not I can consider crying regularly to be my exercise regimen?
I think we can.
All right, all joking aside, no, not really. I will never stop joking. I've often heard or read, rather, although I can't cite any specific sources, that the concept of childhood as like a specific time of life free from responsibility is a relatively recent one. And that early parenting advice seems to track with that. Like, adults didn't have time to drop everything to cater to their children's developmental needs, and the emphasis was on encouraging children to fit into the routines and expectations of the adult world as quickly as possible, no matter how detrimental to the children's mental health.
Yes, childhood is a pretty recent societal construction. And Holt's advice sounds really harsh, but pediatricians were dealing with tons of disease, tons of death in that time period. He was trying to address serious health issues like polio, typhoid, meningitis, scarlet fever, a condition called summer complaint, which is basically diarrhea caused by dirty milk.
Oh,
I know. When Holt worked in New York City hospitals, the mortality rate for infants who had to be hospitalized was 50%. Louis Pasteur had made his discoveries about bacteria, but it hadn't impacted or improved child health yet at that time.
so maybe Holt was just so busy trying to save babies that it just saved time for him to call them it?
Maybe.
Or there's a sense of self-preservation and not getting too attached. Aren't there some cultures that delay even naming babies until a fairly late date, in part to avoid getting too attached, lest the baby die in infancy?
Yes, I remember learning about that when reading a Toni Morrison novel in college. Not in a biology class or anthropology. So Spock himself writes critically about the strict and inflexible schedules that were enforced upon babies in the first half of the 20th century, which doctors were recommending to avoid serious intestinal infections, I'm quoting from the Common Sense book, that afflicted tens of thousands of babies yearly. It was believed that these infections were caused not only by the contamination of milk, but also by wrong proportions in the formula and by irregularity in feeding. Spock, when he was a little baby, he had summer complaint himself. So babies used to die by the thousands. His parents ended up taking him to Maine, which they attributed his recovery to the fresh air.
Aw.
Yeah.
How quaint.
Remember elimination communication and how it made the parenting article rounds in the mid-2010s?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember that. And it's possible I was just paying attention to potty training options because that's, at the time, what phase of parenting I was in. So authoritarians like Holt were all over elimination communication. Another parent advice author named Ray Beery, who authored an early Parents Association publication, recommended beginning toilet training early and with regularity, aided by suppositories, if necessary. Can you imagine?
That is so interesting because I always thought of that as one of the goofier, impractical practices that made its way into this philosophy of parenting that seemed to be 100% based on the needs of the children and never on those of the adults in the family, because it seemed like so much effort up front on the parents' part. But I suppose you could also look on the flip side and think like the earlier the potty training is done, the more your child fits into your family's routine, and just that diapers were less convenient back then.
Right. So like 10 years ago, the idea of dangling an infant over the toilet every 20 minutes or whatever was recommended sounded ridiculous. But I have a washing machine and I had tons of disposable diapers.
Or like just dangling them over the bushes in a park. Do you remember how insane this felt?
Well, I never did it, but I remember it.
No, I didn't. I mean, my kids were too young at the time that these were making the rounds, but like, I couldn't imagine.
Yeah, it sounded bonkers. So also at this period in history, home births were becoming less and less common, and hospital births were increasing, and hospitals provided new mothers with instructional pamphlets. So this shift in where babies were born created a market for parenting literature. In the 1920s, this was the time of, we'll call them behaviorists, like John B. Watson, who was a founder of behaviorism. And these parenting experts advocated that parents show little to no affection to their children. I'm going to read you a summary of Watson's work from an article by Professor Sue Atkinson. Quote, Watson's advice against touching, cuddling, or rocking the baby to sleep was similar to Holt's advice several decades earlier. But while Holt justified his directives with concern for the baby's physical health and survival and mother's workload, Watson gave a psychological rationale. He believed that too much handling and kissing was detrimental to babies, as this treatment would condition children to expect such behavior as they grew up. A boy might become a mama's boy and expect undue attention and affection from his wife. Another writer, Margaret Talbot, writing a New York Times Magazine article in 1999, described Watson's book as, quote, a staunch behaviorist blueprint that stressed regimentation in eating and elimination, warned parents not to hug or kiss their children, and blamed mother love for a generation of mollycoddled complainers, unfit for the rigors of modern capitalism.
This feels so right and so of a piece of all the millennial panic that was going on among baby boomers when we were first becoming adults. You know, as Gen Xers and millennials, we were supposed to be the mollycoddled generations unfit for the rigors of modern capitalism. Come on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But I suppose it would be our grandparents' generation coming up during this time. So, I mean, we call them the greatest generation. I think it must have worked out.
So the authoritarians like Holt were coming from a place of just preventing infant mortality. Watson was coming from a more behavioral psychology point of view, and he was concerned that too much affection would set a child up for failure.
You know, I have a feeling this is going to be a common complaint with me, but I just can't help noticing that all these early advice givers were men who felt the need to stick their noses in to a process that had, prior to the professionalization of medicine, largely been the domain of midwives and women in general. Was this advice just born of their experience of what was appropriate as fathers of the time? Like, spare the rod, spoil the child?
I mean, babies had it rough. We are going to talk about male experts in upcoming episodes, so listeners, stay tuned.
I really wish that we had some sort of audio cue for air quotes, because every time you say male experts, that's what's going on.
Right. So another male expert, Dr. Herman Bundesen, who is a pediatrician and Chicago Health Commissioner, he favored a very strict schedule, training a baby to sleep by making them cry it out, and fresh air, especially cold air, which was considered strengthening.
All that main air, right?
Yes. So Dr. Spock's mother was an adherent to Dr. Holt, and she followed exactly the care and feeding of children. The writer Lynn Bloom, who wrote an earlier Spock biography, wrote that Spock's mother, quote, wanted her children to be hardy, so they slept year-round in an unheated canvas tent erected on the roof of the front porch. Although the chamber pot iced up in the winter, the children survived. And now we're going to listen to a quote from Spock on his mother's strictness from an October 1, 1973 interview in the WNYC Archive Collections.
I certainly was reared strictly. My mother was a very firm-minded, highly moralistic person, and my father, though he didn't lay down as many of the rules, he always supported her. Certainly I was a rebel in feeling against this degree of severity, but you couldn't rebel openly against my mother. If you ever got the least bit impatient or rude to her, she would clamp more punishment on you. So all Spocks had to learn to grind their teeth silently. I mean, Spocks of my generation, I was the oldest of 6.
I believe that this was probably done out of love and fear. Like many, many babies and children died. These poor turn-of-the-century parents, they were just trying to keep their kids alive. But my takeaway...
Really? Were they? Were they? The chamber pot iced up during the winter, Deborah.
One of my takeaways is that the kids of parents who followed the Holt advice had super weird diets. Here's an example. Spock's mother believed, because of Holt, that bananas were a dangerous food for young children. She said that we couldn't even taste a banana until we were 12, and that then we could only eat half a banana. That's a quote from Spock on Spock memoir. And Dr. Holt vigorously condemned cucumbers. Here's Spock again. Once, when I was on a small excursion steamer on the Damariscotta River, I saw a boy about my age, 10, sitting at the stern and munching a whole cucumber. I watched, absolutely horrified, expecting him to keel over dead.
I mean, to be fair, that would be my children's reaction to seeing anyone eating a cucumber at this point, but that's a whole other issue.
Can you imagine? I mean, bananas are like one of the only fruits that one of my kids eats.
Mm-hmm. And they're a super early baby food, too, because you can just mash it with a spoon. Heck, you can hold an actual banana up to an infant's mouth and they'll be fine.
Right. They're not going to choke on it. Spock's diet was pretty weird as a child. The kids in his family always had a separate dinner from the parents. He wrote in his memoir, supper would typically be cereal and applesauce. It was served always at 5:30 p.m. We had to have our baths and be in bed and quiet by 6:45 p.m. because 7 was the time my mother and father would be downstairs starting their candlelit dinner served by the Irish maid. They allowed me to join them at this dignified ceremony when I was 12. It was quite a jump from cereal and applesauce to meat and potatoes and a vegetable and then dessert. And always salad, a slice of canned pineapple on a leaf of lettuce, and a little ball of cream cheese with mayonnaise on the top.
Ooh.
He also wrote that baked beans were never allowed by Dr. Holt. One summer in Maine, his mother, feeling rash, decided that each Spock child could try 2 baked beans and 1 small lobster claw. The Bloom biography of Spock, I read that the Spock children were vegetarians, which is fine.
Cereal and applesauce.
But Dr. Holt recommended that children abstain from raw vegetables, salads, ready-to-serve cereals, hot breads, griddle cakes, pastry, nuts, candy, dried fruits, cherries, berries, bananas, pineapple, lemonade, cider, soda, water, tea, coffee, and alcoholic beverages. So the Spock youngsters lived largely on milk, stewed fruit, oatmeal, and eggs.
Well, thank God we weren't concerned with eggs and cholesterol yet in our collective consciousness. Jeez. It's nice to know that even these blowhards didn't know how to get a kid to eat a balanced diet. I'm also super jealous that they presented these things that are fairly easy to get a kid to eat, like fruits, milk, eggs, and oatmeal as the ideal diet, as opposed to today when we're made to feel bad that our kids aren't delighting in kale salads from birth.
That's true. I mean, what you feed your children is, no matter what time period you're in, it's always fraught. Despite the strict diet and weird meal regimens, Spock's mother, Mildred Louise Stoughton Spock, she was an interesting lady. She did take impeccable care of her kids. And there's an anecdote that comes up in more than one book where all the kids in the family were sick. She had read that pallor, fatigue, and whining were symptoms of mild malaria, but their pediatrician said there's no way that there could be malaria in New Haven where they lived. So she took them to a laboratory, got them tested, and they did have malaria, and she proved the pediatrician wrong. One of Spock's younger siblings, his sister, had scarlet fever, which the pediatrician also denied, but the mother was able to prove that the sister had it after all.
This whole line is making me super uncomfortable, and it's like just treading on like do your own research territory, you know? Because sometimes I really scare myself with how badly I want my doctors and my family's doctors to have all the answers. Especially since COVID, I so deeply want to trust them. But then I hear stories from friends whose doctors swear they need invasive knee surgery when really they've just been walking around with an easily curable infection for literal years, and I despair. I'm not quite to the point in my parenting confidence when I confidently flout a doctor's diagnosis like Mrs. Spock, but I'm not always sure that's a bad thing, as these anecdotes suggest.
Yeah, it's very disconcerting to learn about misdiagnoses and medical mistakes and doctors not listening to their patients. Do you want a sweet story about this box?
Yes, I could really use one.
Okay. So Dr. Benjamin Spock, he was known as Benny when he was little, and he was 9 when his brother Bob was born, and he did a lot of the child caring for Bob. And in his memoir, he writes, that summer's experience identifying with Mother in her love for babies was no doubt the main influence in my decision to go into pediatrics.
Aww.
So we're really doing a fast forward through the 1900s here, but this is a podcast about parenting guides, not a detailed history of pediatrics. So jumping ahead to the 1940s, there's a new school of thought, child development. Arnold Gazelle, who was a psychologist and pediatrician, and Francis Ilge, who was a pediatrician, they published Infant and Child in the Culture Today in 1943. Brief pieces on Spock will contrast him with Holt and Watson and portray him as a radical departure from these strict rules about scheduling babies and raising children, but Spock was really building upon and responding to Gazelle and Bundesen. So I mentioned Professor Sue Atkinson before. She writes, while Spock's book is popularly credited as a radical departure from the strictness of the past, it built on Gazelle's work in the early 1940s and the mood of the post-war years away from the behaviorism of the late 1920s. In fact, both the infant care pamphlets and Bundesen's work predate Spock's landmark book, suggesting that Spock reflected, rather than pioneered, new ideas about parenting. So Spock describes mothers who kept their babies on this strict feeding schedule as listening to their babies for hours crying just because they were hungry. And the strictness in feeding schedules bled into affection. Doctors and nurses at the time taught mothers that feeding their babies whenever they were hungry would lead to spoiling the child. And in the general enthusiasm for strictness, mothers were usually advised to ignore their baby except at feeding time.
Again, this is just like a topsy-turvy, upside-down world. So the prevailing wisdom when my kids were little, and I'm sure it was some version of this when your kids were little, was how dare you not immediately answer your baby's cry no matter the circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
I vividly remember using the Ferber method to teach sleep training and being just pilloried by mothers who I thought of as friends for ignoring my child's needs in these ways. So the fact that that was the prevailing wisdom in the middle of the 20th century is just bonkers.
It is bonkers. And to just ignore your child. I remember reading that you should talk to your baby as much as possible. Otherwise, they would not have a good vocabulary when they grew up. Yeah. So I paid so much attention to my kids. Which,
how's their vocabulary?
Decent. I don't know if it has anything to do with what I did when they were babies, though. So Spock says he didn't do a lot of research. Instead, he drew upon his 10 years of pediatric practice when he was writing the book. But he does admit that he cribbed 2 ideas from recent books. The chatty style that was comforting to mothers came from Bartlett, and he tried for Gazelle and Ilge's reassuring style. And his book didn't include earliest or average ages for development because he felt that that contributed to anxiety of parents who were like measuring their child against these sort of arbitrary timelines.
I dig that. When did we move away from that? All my childhood books had average ages for development.
Right. Was Spock popular because the advice written before baby and childcare was pretty bad?
I mean, yes. The world was so different between when Dr. Emmett Holt was trying to save the lives of babies who drank spoiled milk, right? So much changed in that early part of the 1900s. If we just take the text of Holt's advice, it sounds awful. But when we put it into the context of babies dying because of inadequate and unsafe food storage, it makes sense. And with the invention of pasteurization and more homes having refrigerators, the food supply was much safer. Babies weren't dying of summer complaint. By the time Spock was writing Baby and Childcare, it was a new era. Because of industrialization and urbanization and the Depression, more babies were being born in hospitals, more young parents were living away from extended family and matriarchal support. And who wants to let a baby go 4 whole hours between bottles, right?
Right. So let's say the advice written before Spock's Baby and Childcare wasn't bad, it was different. It was just an earlier era of parents and society. So let's go to a segment we're calling New Spock, Old Spock. In this segment, we'll take a look at early Spock advice and see what has changed since the mid-1900s.
For this episode, we're going back to the delivery room. Oops, nope, no, we're not. Because this is about dads, and dads weren't allowed in the delivery room.
The 1957 edition of the Common Sense Book of Baby and Childcare describes dads in the hospital waiting room while the mother gives birth. The father is apt to feel particularly left out during the hospital period with his first baby. He helps to get his wife safely to the hospital, where there are dozens of people to take care of her. Then he's really alone, with nothing to do outside of working hours. He can sit in the waiting room with some old magazines and worry about how the labor is going, or he can go to his unbelievably lonely home. It's no wonder that a man may take this occasion to drink in company at a bar. So what do later editions say about fathers and hospitals?
Well, okay, so let's just contextualize the 10th edition a little bit. We said it was published in 2018, and it was updated and revised by a doctor named Robert Needleman, and he didn't work directly with Spock, but he was a student of another pediatrician, Stephen Parker, who Spock worked with on the 7th edition before he died. And let's just say that there's absolutely zero consideration given to the idea that a father might not be in the delivery room. So the 10th edition says, quote, A generation ago, most fathers would never have dreamed of reading a book about raising babies. Now, it almost goes without saying that fathers participate at every stage. They go to prenatal visits, attend childbirth classes, and support their partners in labor and delivery. They aren't lonely, excluded onlookers anymore. Deborah, when you were planning your hospital stay with your first kid, was there ever any thought that your husband might not be in the delivery room with you?
No. That was just what people did.
Exactly.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Spock Talk. Please subscribe so you are sure to get our next episode, in which we'll explore how Dr. Benjamin Spock's privileged background helped him establish himself as an authority on child rearing.
See this episode's show notes for our references. And if you like what you're hearing, give us a like or a share on social media. Rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Listen to our other podcast, It's My Screen Time Too, where we review TV shows and movies made for kids.
We'll see you soon the next time we talk Spock.
Spock talk, Spock talk.